Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jeff. We're starting to discuss Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through 18 today, which follows what we were discussing last week. Last week, we were talking about Paul's thanksgiving and prayer to the Philippians and how he loves this church in such a way because this church has so much going for it. It has an involved membership. It has an involved and role-driven leadership. I mean, they have elders who have taken upon themselves to be serious elders. They have deacons who have taken themselves to be serious deacons. And they have Christians who have taken upon themselves to be very serious Christian, where the spreading of the gospel is the most important thing in their life. And so his response to this is that he's thankful to God. He thanks God for them. He thanks God every time he prays. He thinks about them every time he prays. And it's just, he wants them to just do the work that God has driven them, put in their hearts to do. But what about him? And that's what he's going to talk about this week in verses 12 through 18, just kind of a couple of things that are going on with him. But a bigger idea that we are able to take away from what we're going to talk about today is that idea of how much power we have to respond to the things that are happening to us. Not just during COVID-19, but let's face it, everyday life, things happen to us. Some things are a blessing. Some things we might view at the time as curses. And we sometimes forget that we have so much power in the realm of how am I going to respond to X, Y, and Z? How am I going to respond to that bad thing? How am I going to respond to that frustrating thing? How am I going to respond to that situation where somebody else might be getting credit, or somebody who does less than me is getting more notice? Or maybe I feel like I'm not doing enough and somebody else who is in a similar position as me is doing more, so I feel down on myself. All these thoughts go around in our heads. You know, we feel tempted to be angry, to be frustrated, and to let the situation of the world, or the situation of my mind, the situation of just how I feel about life, drive my motivation to the point where that dictates how much I do versus how much I don't do. And Paul really smacks it today in talking about that, which it says in verse 12 of Philippians 1. He says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. We're going to talk about two key situations in Paul's life right now. One is the fact that he's in prison. And the other is the fact that there's preachers out there who are not preaching the word with, you might call, moral, upright motives. All right, they're a little bit self-seeking. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. But the first problem is that he's in prison. Now, we hit this in the introduction, but again, let's just think about something. If there was ever a situation where we might give someone a pass for not doing all the work that they've been called to, it's when they're in a prison situation, isn't it? I mean, sometimes Paul had been literally locked up in a prison. Other times we might call it house arrest, where he's able to live in a house but just can't go tons of places by himself. We might say, okay, you're in prison. Okay, you get a pass. All right. You don't have to worry about it for now. You got a pass because there's not much you can do. Well, that's not the way he views it. He wants the church in Philippi to know, just as much as the church in Philippi is working, just as active as they are, just as spirit-driven as they are, Paul, while in prison, is also seeking to be just as hardworking and just as spirit-driven. Because for a couple of reasons. First off, he doesn't view being arrested and put in prison as a hindrance to the gospel. In fact, he views it as something that can advance the gospel. Well, how can being locked up in prison advance the gospel? Well, a couple of ways that we can talk about here and now, and that is one, the existence of the prison epistles. Again, Philippians, Galatians, Ephesians, and Colossians, all written in prison. Paul did that while he was in prison. While Paul's in prison, he is still seeking to shepherd the churches and seeking to help the churches to become better. As far as the Bible goes, those are the letters that we have. Do I believe that the only letters that Paul wrote in prison were Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philippians? No, probably not. Not as much of a letter writer as Paul was. It's very possible that he wrote others. It's very possible that he wrote others to individuals, kind of like 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, letters like this that, although those letters survived, other letters just might not have. In other words, even though he was in prison, he was being a teacher, being a mentor through correspondence, written correspondence, letter writing. He was still being effective as a minister, as an apostle. Also, verse 13, very important, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. Not only are Christians outside the prison walls and other locations that Paul might be writing to, not only are those people receiving news of the glory of Christ, but the very guards who are guarding Paul, who are stuck with Paul, they're also hearing about the gospel. Now, do they believe the gospel? Okay, we're not told that, but that's not the point. That's not the point. It's Paul's job, just like ours. It is our job as Christians to sow seed. It's God's job to give the increase. We sow, we water, but God gives the increase. We work in that field, but we also trust God to give the increase. What happened to those guards? I don't know. And that's really outside of Paul's purview. The point is that he's working. He is still working to advance the gospel. Because again, how do we view life? Is Paul merely locked away in prison and surrounded by guards? Or is Paul in a locked area surrounded by people who have to be there and have nowhere else to go? And so Paul, being Paul, he's going to take this opportunity to speak to them. Paul's not locked up with them. They're locked up with Paul. And if they're going to be locked up with Paul, rest assured, they're going to hear about Jesus Christ. And so he's going to take that and he's going to work that situation that has been given to him. Now, is this the mission field that Paul might have wanted? Maybe, maybe not. But if we seek to live our lives strictly for this hand-picked mental image of what we think the perfect missionary opportunity is going to be, we're going to set ourselves up for disappointment. Will I ever get to go and work at the Nema House in Africa? Something that Sharon and I want to do. Maybe, maybe not. But am I able to be in the Rio Grande Valley in the year 2020 and work with the situation that is around me now? Yes, if I choose to do it. So don't wait for the silver lining missionary effort that we would just love to throw our lives to, go into some far distant land to work with people in a different culture that is totally foreign to anything that we have possible. We don't have that right now. But what do we have right now? That's our reality, and that's our mission field. And so Paul is going to take advantage of that mission field. And most of the brothers, he says in verse 14, and most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. So that's something else that's going on because Paul has been locked away. The gospel is advancing. The gospel is advancing to prison guards as well as to churches whom Paul's able to write. But as the story of Paul's imprisonment spreads, other brothers inside the body of Christ are becoming more bold to speak the gospel. That's another boomeranging effect. This is something, do we realize that what we do in life has the ability to inspire others? And if we are bold enough to speak Christ and to share others the message of Christ, that does have the effect and the opportunity, not just to win converts who don't know Christ, but to also inspire others who already know Christ, and they're just trying to be motivated in some way. And they can be inspired by the actions of others. I've been blessed to be able to become really good friends with a couple of missionary families. They inspire me, they teach me, and they make me want to become more than I am for the cause of Christ. Would I have felt this way if I didn't meet them? Probably not. But that's the thing about being able to learn from each other. And that's what actions of Paul here is doing with the brothers. They're getting much more bold to speak the word without fear. Okay? We might know enough Bible to be dangerous, so to speak, or we might be familiar enough with the Bible to be able to speak, but can we speak it without fear? Are we scared of the repercussions of sharing the gospel? This is something that can hamstring Christians to this day. People become scared. Let's seek to be people who can spread the gospel without fear. So that's one. Paul's locked away in prison. The prison guards are learning it. He's letter writing, and he's also inspiring other Christians with his actions. That's the first situation of how him being locked away in prison doesn't have to affect his mood. But there's also another situation going on here, and that is the actions of preachers whom motives might be questionable. Here's what he says. In verse 15, it says, "Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that it is in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice." You see, when we are able to put the spread of the gospel first and foremost on our minds, ahead of pride, ahead of ego, ahead of hurt feelings, ahead of insecurities, ahead of anything else, then we can let so much personal junk go and just get on with spreading the work of the gospel. If we do not allow ourselves to be slowed down by life, let the gospel go. Because here's the thing. Some preach the gospel. There were other preachers in the first century besides the Apostle Paul, and he knew that too. But he also knew that some people preach the gospel out of different motives. It's just like today. All right. Some people get into ministry because they think it's going to lead to wealth, notoriety, or things of this nature. These earthly gifts. All right. First of all, if we get into ministry because of the financial reward out of it, we are totally in this for the wrong reason. Going into ministry for money is like going into teaching for money. You just don't do it. And so many of those good career paths, teachers, policemen, and whatnot, you don't do it for the money. There has to be a love there for the career and also for your fellow man that makes getting up in the morning worth it. That makes going to work every day worth it, which makes putting up with the nonsense of the world worth it. Okay. But some people do preach for wrong motives. In Paul's case, there's some preaching out of envy and rivalry. It's like, why would they do it? Jesus faced those people all the time. People who are using God, in that case, for something for themselves. And where there's the bad ones, there's also the good ones, those who preach out of goodwill. And as Paul tells us, the latter, which is those who preach out of goodwill, they do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. They do it out of love. There has to be love. Love for God, love for Christ, love for the Spirit, but also love for our brothers and sisters in Christ. Those very ones that could very possibly drive us nuts. We need to love them if we're going to be preachers of God's gospel. And they continue to do it. And they also know Paul in prison. He's not in prison because of something Paul did. He's in prison for the advancement of the gospel, the defense of the gospel. Now, the former, those who are envy and rivalry, they proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition and not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. There are some who are preaching the gospel trying to be better than the Apostle Paul, like it's some sort of contest. Paul's not in a preaching contest with anyone. There's tons of ministers, there's tons of preachers in the world all over. I have some very good friends that are preachers. Guess what? I'm not in a contest with them. They're not in a contest with me. There are people out there who preach, and there are very good preachers, and there are better preachers out there than me. There are better preachers out there than anybody who walks the globe. But guess what? We're not in a contest with each other. We shouldn't be. But there's some who are. There are some who deem success in ministry through those earthly lenses, thinking as long as I have a following, as long as I am financially compensated, as long as I have a name out there that people can recognize, I am being successful. And so they do this, and during a time when Paul's in prison, selfish ambition is leading them to not proclaim the gospel with good motives. And they think that if they're able to proclaim the gospel, still get out there and proclaim the gospel while Paul's locked away in prison, they can use that in order to break the heart of the Apostle Paul. Look, we can go, but you have to stay. Look at us go and do the work that you think you should be doing, but you can't because you're in prison. How does that make you feel, Paul? Well, how does that make Paul feel? This is how it makes Paul feel. What then? What then? Who cares? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. That's his attitude. His attitude is some people preach the message out of good ambition. Some people preach the message out of bad ambition. How do I feel about it? Who cares? Why? Because as long as they are preaching truth, regardless if it's a good ambition or a bad ambition, as long as truth is being proclaimed, Paul's rejoicing. As long as it's truth, it's not important to Paul what the motivation of the speaker is, as long as the truth is being presented. And as long as the truth is being presented, Paul will rejoice. In fact, he'll say it again. Yes, and I will rejoice. How do we view life? Do we view life from the aspect of, I hope that I can be involved. I need to be a big whale. I need to be a big fish in this pond. I need to be very important for the work to continue on. Or do I have the attitude of, God's will be done, may truth be presented. If I'm a part of it, I hope that I can bring something to it and be a benefit to those who are involved. If I'm not a part of it, glory to God, the truth is still being presented. You know, I mentioned those missionaries earlier. Give you this example, and we'll wrap up with this. And I told them I have a tendency of wearing my emotion and my feelings on my sleeve if I'm not careful. And I remember after I got to know them, after a period of time, I told them, I said, look, you know, it's great to be able to know you all missionaries who have left everything you know. One couple spent 40 or 50 years down in Mexico having to learn the language and become part of that society. And they did that for 40 or 50 years straight. They were missionaries. Another missionary family I know, they've been to the Philippines, they've been to Africa, they've been to Greece, they've been to China, they've worked with the underground church, they've set up churches, they've gone to all these other places. And sometimes I'll look at them, it's like, it's so great, everything that y'all been able to do. And then I look around. I've never been outside the United States for any length of time. And that temptation, it is a temptation. That temptation starts going in your head. You haven't done as much as someone else. But then it's like they have to slap me upside the head and say, it's not about that, and it was never about that. They had to go out there. Other people have to stay here because the gospel needs to be everywhere. The gospel needs to be taught everywhere. Truth needs to be preached everywhere. So don't get down in the dumps in case we've never been able to go elsewhere in order to proclaim the gospel, because the chances are you are exactly where you need to be in order for truth to be shared. And as long as truth is being shared everywhere and the places where you are and you're able to be active in it, and other places where you are not and are not able to be a part of it, as long as truth is being proclaimed, rejoice. As long as truth is being shared, rejoice. Are people more popular than you? Are people more successful than you? Are people been able to do more than you? Stop. is truth being proclaimed. And if truth is being proclaimed, get that pride out of there and rejoice at the fact that truth is being proclaimed. Blessings to you all. We're all in this together. Next week, we're going to take up that rejoicing attitude and talk about the next section of the book of Philippians, which is going to be Philippians chapter 1, the back part of verse 18, all the way down to verse 30, which is the ending of chapter 1. So we'll see you next time. Take care.